before we begin, what time is it right now? And where are you listening from? Leave a comment, not just for me, but for someone else out there, wide awake, just like you. It's a quiet reminder that none of us are truly alone tonight. And if this kind of calm, forgotten history helps you drift off, subscribe now. Every night, without even trying, you'll have something to fall asleep to. No noise, no drama, just sleep, wrapped in the past. Asterisk in the cold archives of European history, buried beneath battles and kings and maps redrawn. With blood, there are the lives of daughters quiet, transaction-like, and rarely remembered. A few stories of these women echo quite like that of Isabella of Valois. Not because she shaped a nation or led an army, but because she was a child sold twice in the name of peace. Because her worth was calculated not by her character, but by how many coins could be squeezed from the vaults of a tired kingdom. It was the 1390s. France was trying, yet failing, to steady itself after years of internal strife and the chaos of war. King Charles VI, known to history as Charles the Mad, was prone to fits of violence and delusion, so severe he often forgot who he was. One year, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. Another, he chased servants through the palace with a sword. In short, France was not exactly stable. On the other side of the Channel, England wasn't much better. King Richard II, childless and desperate for a political win, was trying to navigate the endless back and forth of the 100 Years' War with France. The war had dragged on for decades, not as one lone campaign, but as intermittent chaos raids, pillaging, sieges, and sudden peace talks that often fell apart by supper. And that's where Isabella came in. She was not even 10 years old when Richard proposed to marry her, a girl of 8, bright and small, sent across the sea to marry a man nearly 30 years her senior. It wasn't love, it wasn't desire. It wasn't even politics in the usual sense. It was damage control. France and England were both teetering on the edge of collapse. A marriage, however inappropriate, was a symbol and anchor in a storm. Symbols are expensive. Isabella's dowry was the largest ever proposed in French history at that time, 800,000 francs. To grasp what that meant in the late 14th century, imagine a sum so vast it could pay for an army, rebuild a city, or bankrupt a crown. But the money didn't exist. Not in gold, not in silver, not even in empty promises. France, for all its titles and lands, didn't have the coins, but they did have influence. So, they mortgaged land, forced towns to surrender funds, taxed noble families, and sold royal heirlooms, all to pay for a girl who had no say in the matter. Isabella, the second youngest daughter of Charles VI, had become currency. The wedding itself was staged with dazzling theatricality to hide the desperation beneath it. Richard II crossed the Channel with an enormous entourage. He wore robes embroidered with pearls, diva, musicians, dancers, tapestries of gold thread. But beneath the glamour was tension. Both kingdoms were aware this wasn't a marriage of equals. It was more like the last dice roll of two rulers trying not to lose their thrones. And still, Isabella was only a child. Reports from the time describe her as graceful and charming, which, in diplomatic code, meant she looked healthy and hadn't yet learned to speak for herself. That was ideal. The wedding ceremony was more of a ritual than a union. Isabella, dressed in heavy layers of silk and fur, far too large for her frame, stood beside Richard, who, at 29, had already earned a reputation for cruelty masked by charm. The marriage was not consummated. They agreed, publicly at least, that she would remain a virgin until she reached maturity. But maturity, like peace, has many definitions. After the wedding, Isabella was whisked to England with a small army of attendants, governesses, tutors, and French nobles assigned to keep her occupied and, more importantly, loyal. Her life in England was less a royal upbringing and more a diplomatic quarantine. She lived in a series of castles, each one grand and freezing. She was instructed in English etiquette, but never allowed true freedom. Every letter she wrote was screened. Every conversation she had was noted, and the dowry was paid in increments through borrowed gold and forced pledges. Towns in France were taxed again and again. The people began to resent her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her marriage became a symbol of their poverty. It was said in whispers that the roads were broken and the grain stores empty because of the little girl sent away to England. Her name became shorthand for royal waste. Meanwhile, Richard's own grip on power was slipping. His court was divided. His nobles were restless. He had exiled and executed some of his closest advisors, creating enemies everywhere. The treasury, already drained by war, could barely afford to keep the palaces warm, but he still had Isabella. As long as she was queen technically, he had leverage with France. That's how he saw her. Not as a person, but as a strategic pawn he could move or guard, depending on how the game unfolded. Yet games rarely go as planned. Just 3 years after the wedding, in 1399, Richard II was overthrown by his cousin, Conry Bolingbroke, who would become King Henry IV. Richard was captured, imprisoned, and quietly murdered a year later. No trial, no rebellion, no resistance from France, and that left Isabella in limbo. Her husband was dead, her title meaningless, her dowry, what little of it had been delivered, was absorbed into the new English court. She was now a teenage widow in a foreign land. Her usefulness evaporated almost overnight. Henry IV did not send her home, not immediately. He had a different plan. He offered to marry her to his son, the future Henry V. It would keep the alliance alive and bind her even tighter to England. But this time, Isabella said no. It was one of the rare recorded instances of a royal bride refusing a match. She was 13. What happened next is rarely discussed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was slow, boring even. She was escorted back to France, quietly, no ceremony, no parade. Her attendants were dismissed, one by one. Her clothes were changed back to French styles. She was no longer Queen of England, just a girl whose body had been bartered for peace and profit, and whose value had expired the moment the political winds changed. And yet, as she stepped off the ship and was back onto French soil, with her dowry squandered and her childhood gone, one question hovered in the silence of the dockside fog. What becomes of a girl who's already been sold once and survived it? There are few places lonelier than a palace for the politically unwanted. When Isabella of Valois returned to France in 1401, the quiet that met her was not celebratory. It was logistical. She was not a queen returning in glory. She was more like an account being closed, a ledger marked returned. Her titles had been stripped, and the English dower, never fully paid, was unrecoverable. The girl herself was the only portion of the deal that remained intact. She arrived in Paris with no triumphal entry, no proclamation of freedom. She was received by a reduced court that didn't quite know what to do with her. France had changed in her absence. Her father, Charles VI, was still king, but only in name. His mental illness had grown worse by this point. He often believed he was made of glass and refused to be touched. The real power rested in factions, regents, and opportunists. Isabella's mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was preoccupied with the kingdom's unraveling. France was no safer or more stable than when Isabella had left. In some ways, it was worse. And while her daughter's return stirred brief whispers in the corridors of diplomacy, no one had time for a former queen of a failed marriage, so she was quietly tucked away. Her days became routines of prayer, embroidery, and ceremonial silence. Her household was modest. Guardians were appointed, not affectionate. She was closely watched, not for her safety, okay, but to ensure she didn't make any political alliances without royal approval. Asterisk, but the court did still see one use for her. She was not yet 15, and she was still unmarried. This meant she was still a bargaining chip, just not as valuable as before. She'd already been used once. Still, in the right hands, she could anchor a new alliance, a better one that suited France's shifting priorities. And so began the second negotiation. This time, the prospective groom was Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was 17, noble-born, wealthy, and conveniently French. More importantly, he was the king's nephew. A union between Charles and Isabella would keep her within the royal family, while also patching over cracks that had widened during the power struggles of her father's illness. Asterisk, it wasn't about love, though the official letters used poetic language to imply affection. It was about appearances, marrying Isabella to a French noble after her failed English. Queenhood meant reclaiming her value and proving France could protect its daughters. It was a subtle political message aimed both inward and outward. A declaration that no foreign crown could take from France without repayment. Asterisk, but beneath the surface, there was a subtle cruelty in it, because Isabella had no choice. She was still recovering from her years in England, still shaped by a childhood filled with cold castles, scripted lessons, and whispered insults from foreign courtiers. Now, instead of being allowed to grow into herself, to reflect, or even grieve, she was once again being wrapped in ceremonial silks and handed off. The marriage, too. Charles was formalized in 1406, when Isabella was 16. Asterisk. This time, there were no grand ships crossing seas, no royal trumpets, just a ceremony, quiet and restrained, in Compiègne. The dowry was modest, a fraction of what had once been demanded. After all, she wasn't a political prize anymore. She was a symbol of old negotiations. Daughter whose use was limited to domestic leverage. Charles himself was polite, thoughtful, even, and not nearly as domineering as Richard had been. But he was also a poet, a wanderer, a man more interested in metaphors than marriage. He wrote long verses about flowers and the moon. He spent nights composing riddles, and while he did his duty as a husband, he remained more loyal to his own imagination than to any courtly ambition. Isabella's second marriage was peaceful. Yes, but it was also quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of a girl quarantined in a foreign land, but the quiet of a woman being slowly erased from the conversation altogether. France moved on. New alliances were forged. New wars began. Her name appeared less and less in records, and when it did, it was usually as a footnote, wife of the Duke of Orleans. Never mind that she had once been a queen, teeth that she had once represented a nation's hopes, a treasury's worth, continent's dream of peace. No, now she was just another duchess in the background, and then hanged in 1409 at the age of just 19. She died. The cause was never clearly stated in the chronicles. Some claimed it was a difficult pregnancy, others said it was illness. A few suggested emotional strain, that her heart had been too worn out by the weight of expectations and roles. She never chose. Whatever the cause, her passing was mourned quietly. Her funeral was held at BYU. There were no grand monuments erected in her name. No royal court paused its affairs for her. A handful of poems were written, most by Charles, her husband, who was more skilled at grief on the page than affection. In life, one of his verses mourned her as a rose pressed between pages, beautiful and flat, never fully able to bloom. But the reality was more bureaucratic than romantic. With Isabella's death, his French crown had one less pawn to move. Her dowries, one paid, one not, were now part of national memory. Her life had been reduced to transactions. First, to secure a fragile peace with England, then to shore up a domestic alliance. In both cases, her body was the currency, her comfort, her choices, her voice relevant. And so, the question lingers not in royal records, but in the overlooked margins of European history. How many times can a daughter be used as payment before she disappears from the account entirely? Asterisk Isabella of Valois died quietly, not in rebellion, not in triumph, but in a room most historians cannot locate, in a gown history never bothered to describe, surrounded by attendants whose names were not written down. And for a woman whose life had once commanded the attention of two thrones, her death passed, like a soft page turned too quickly. But this is what happens when a life is measured, not in moments, but in dowries. Her first was a bargain too large to pay. Her second, a symbol too modest to matter. In both cases, her worth was fixed to the fortunes of men, her father's madness, her husband's failures, the ledger books of kingdoms struggling to stay afloat. When she died in 1409, aged 19, there was no international mourning, no diplomatic ripple. She did not die a queen. She died a duchess, a second wife, a former bride to a forgotten king. Her tomb was not carved from gold. Her eulogy was not read from pulpits in Paris or Westminster. And in the century that followed, her name slowly drifted into silence. But her legacy remained, not in the way kings and nobles are remembered, but in the way bureaucracies work around the lives of girls. You see, Isabella was one of the earliest examples in Western Europe of a royal daughter being passed twice as both a marital asset and a diplomatic correction. That's not unusual. What made it bureaucratically significant was how explicitly the ledgers followed her, every step of her life, from the day she was betrothed to Richard, to the moment she was married to the Duke of Orleans, was recorded in account books, tax orders, land deeds, and transaction scrolls. Her clothing was tallied, her housing costs itemized, her attendants were budgeted, even her time in England was tracked not by emotional experience, but by a financial burn rate. She cost more to keep than a standing garrison. That's how the French crown learned from her. Future negotiations, like those for her younger sister, Michelle, or for later queens, like Margaret of Anjou, were shaped by Isabella's balance sheet. The court began standardizing the cost of princesses. Dowries were normalized into a range. Marriage negotiations became less about poetry and more about debt management. Royal daughters became lines in national budgets, their value discussed in committees before they were old enough to speak for themselves. Isabella's short, quiet life had become a precedent in the generations that followed. Entire classes of noble women were assigned value according to the balance sheets she helped shape. A wealthy house might ask, what did France pay for Isabella? And someone in the treasury might answer with a precise number. That number became a starting point, a ceiling, or, more cruelly, a warning. Isabella wasn't the first daughter used as a diplomatic asset, but she was one of the first to be so, thoroughly reduced to one. There are no passionate love letters from Richard to her, no grand speeches of admiration from her second husband. Her recorded words are few. She didn't write memoirs. Her letters were filtered, her public voice muted, and yet her story left traces not in chronicles, but in how kingdoms organize the lives of royal girls. What's curious, key, is that Isabella's death didn't lead to outrage or reevaluation. No one said, we must do better for our daughters. Instead, the apparatus became more efficient. Her experience taught rulers how to price peace, how to bury inconvenience, how to budget for the disposal of a queen. Even her husband, Charles of Orleans, who mourned her in verses, moved on. He married again, twice. His poetry became more elaborate. His reputation as a literary noble grew in later years. would become a patron of the arts and a figure of courtly elegance, but he rarely mentioned Isabella again, and the England she left behind forgot her quickly. Richard II's legacy collapsed with him. Henry IV reshaped the narrative. Later, chroniclers erased her role, describing her instead as a temporary queen, an asterisk in a footnote of succession. And France. France buried her in Blois, without marble, without spectacle, a few records confirming that she had died, and that she was no longer a diplomatic concern. Still, there is something haunting about the silence she left, because while her name faded, the machinery that handled her grew sharper. Future princesses were watched more closely, their marriages scheduled more aggressively, their dowries always weighed against the needs of the state. In a way, Isabella became less a person and more a template. But occasionally, in the long corridors of historical memory, someone returns to her story. A scholar, a writer, a curious listener, perhaps lying awake, and they discover not scandal, not betrayal, but something much duller and much sadder. They find a girl born into a palace where only freedom was silence. They find a girl who wore crowns like shackles and whose education prepared her only for exchange. They find a girl traded not once, but twice, and then quietly, without resistance, return to the earth. And as you sit with that knowledge, in the late hours of a quiet evening, begins to unfold, one that history rarely pauses to ask. When a royal daughter is used up, priced out, and finally forgotten, who mourns her? Asterisk in the grand sweep of medieval history, some stories unfold with trumpets and triumph, and others slip silently into the corners of record books, dust-covered and forgotten. Eleanor of Brittany belongs to the latter. There were no crowds at her final breath, no poems composed in her honor, no charges ever filed, and yet she spent nearly 4 decades imprisoned by the English crown, without a trial, without a sentence, and without a single recorded word of rebellion. Her crime: being born too close to a throne. It began with a war of inheritance, because in medieval Europe, the death of a king rarely meant peace. It meant questions. And in 1199, when Richard the Lionheart died without an heir, the English crown was up for grabs. 2 men emerged with claims. One was John, Richard's younger brother. The other was Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew, and, arguably, the rightful heir under standard feudal law. Arthur was just a boy, but he had one advantage. He was the son of Geoffrey, the older brother who had died before Richard. Under the principle of primogeniture, that meant Arthur stood ahead of John in the line of succession. And many French nobles, especially those in Brittany and Anjou, supported him. But John had other plans. Arthur was captured in 1202 during a campaign in Normandy and vanished the following year. Most historians agreed that John had him killed, likely strangled in a drunken fit of paranoia. But his sister, Eleanor of Brittany, survived. She was about 15 years old when her brother disappeared, and suddenly this was the last surviving link between the Plantagenets and the rival Angevin line that made her dangerous. Asterisk. Not because she led armies, she didn't. Not because she called for rebellion, she never did. She was dangerous simply because her blood might inspire someone else to do those things. A noble with a grudge, a foreign prince, a French king, someone might use her name, her mere existence, as justification for revolt. So King John had her arrested. No trial, no charges, no ceremony, just a quiet removal. Eleanor was taken from her estates in Brittany and transported to England, first to Corfe Castle, then to Salisbury, then to other strongholds across the kingdom. She was moved often, perhaps to prevent rescue, perhaps to break her spirit, or perhaps because even her jailers weren't sure what to do with her long term. But the orders were clear. She was not to be released. Eleanor of Brittany would spend the next 39 years in captivity. No court, no confession, no verdict. Just time. Her confinement was not entirely brutal, not at first. She was granted noble accommodations, which meant she had her own rooms, access to books, and the company of servants. But she could not leave. She could not marry. She could not correspond freely. She was not allowed to produce heirs. Every aspect of her life was controlled. And perhaps, most chilling of all, her name was kept off of every document relating to succession. Officially, she didn't exist. There were periods when her living expenses were generously covered. Well, records show that she was sent expensive cloth, fur-lined cloaks, and sweetmeats. But these were not signs of affection. They were signs of guilt, or, perhaps more accurately, the price of keeping her quiet. Her guards changed over the years. The monarchs did too. When King John died in 1216, his son Henry III took the throne, and Eleanor remained locked away. Not because of anything she had done, but because of what her freedom might suggest. By then, she was in her 30s. No longer a child, but still unmarried, still watched, still alone. Even Pope Honorius III wrote to England urging her release, stating that it was not fitting to imprison a noblewoman without cause. But nothing came of it, because Eleanor's imprisonment was not about justice. It was about optics, risk management, the machinery of medieval monarchy, where a single loose thread could unravel decades of power. And so, the woman who had once stood in the line of succession found herself reduced to a political shadow. She was allowed to walk castle gardens, but never beyond the walls. She was permitted visitors, mostly servants, rarely friends. And she grew old, watching the world change without her. Kings died. Wars began. Territories were lost and regained. Languages shifted. Customs evolved. But Eleanor of Brittany remained exactly where she had been since she was 15, in a room designed to look like a home, but built to ensure she'd never leave. There is no record of her complaining, no journals, no accounts of her plotting escape. It's just a few royal expense rolls, noting the delivery of velvet, dried fruits, and wax candles. The silence is the point, because Eleanor's story is not one of resistance, it's one of erasure, and yet leaves us with a quiet and persistent question. How do you measure a life when the world decides you're too dangerous to live it? Asterisk, Eleanor of Brittany, once a niece, 2 kings, and a duchess in title, became something else entirely as the years passed. A footnote kept alive in fiscal records. There are no surviving letters from her, no journals, no emotional testimonies. We know of her days, how she dressed, what she ate, whether she was moved. She was found almost entirely in accounting roles. That is how the state remembered her, not as a woman, not as a political prisoner, but as an ongoing expense. The legends tell us she had 3 maids, 2 chamberlains, and was allowed 1 musician. She had an allowance for robes dyed in deep blues and greens, and fur from lynx and miniver. When her birthday approached, she was sometimes sent extra wine or candied almonds, corded neatly beside parchment and ink. There's something hollow in that detail, almost cruel to know she was thought of, yes, but only when it came time to tally what she cost. Under King Henry III, her confinement continued without pause. It had been under his father John that her imprisonment began, but Henry showed no sign of regret. If anything, he institutionalized it. The young king came to view her not as a person, but as a kind of political liability built into the budget. She was kept mostly at Bristol Castle by then. Our reports ken from financial documents that repairs were made to her rooms, and that glass windows were installed, a rare luxury. She had her own garden, too, surrounded by high walls, not for her privacy, but to ensure her seclusion. Even the gardeners were carefully selected, often rotated, and still, no one ever asked her why she thought she was there. That's part of the machinery. You see, It was easier for the crown to pretend she had never posed a threat than to admit she was being punished preemptively. The law couldn't touch her because no law had been broken. That's what made her so uniquely dangerous. If she had taken up arms, they could have charged her. If she had written proclamations, they could have silenced her through force. But she had done nothing, just breathed and lived and existed. That was enough. Even when Henry III married and had children of his own, Eleanor's status remained unchanged. She no longer posed a threat to the succession, but now releasing her would be an admission, a public signal that she'd been unjustly detained. And what would that say about the stability of the throne? So she stayed, year after year, decade after decade. There are references in the pipe rolls, England's detailed annual fiscal records, syndicating she was moved from Bristol to Gloucester for a brief time, and then back again. One record notes a repair to her bath. Another mentions the purchase of prayer books, but there's no mention of her voice, what she said, whether she cried, whether she asked for her release, whether she dreamed of another life. We do know she aged slowly in her captivity. By the time she turned 50, Kay contemporaries in the royal family were mostly gone. Henry III had grown gray, ruling a country that barely remembered its Plantagenet. Cousins in Brittany, his sons, including the future Edward I, were rising in courtly power. England itself was changing more literate, more bureaucratic, and increasingly tangled in its own internal feuds. But Eleanor's situation did not change. With the times, she became a kind of living relic, a reminder of older wars and older fears, still confined, still watched, still recorded in ledgers that treated her as a necessary cost of doing royal business. What's perhaps most telling is the royal, still, she was never given. Despite being the daughter of Geoffrey Plantagenet and having once been publicly acknowledged as the heir to Brittany, Eleanor was never granted a personal seal as a noblewoman. In medieval Europe, seals weren't just tools, they were identities. The absence of one meant she couldn't authenticate letters, couldn't legally represent herself, couldn't negotiate or manage her own affairs. In other words, she couldn't speak, even if she had written volumes of letters, and we have no reason to believe she did. They would not have been valid without her seal. No court would accept them. No noble would risk supporting her. Her lack of a seal was not an oversight, it was policy, a slow, calculated silencing, and still, the money flowed. Each year, the exchequer paid for Eleanor's robes, her food, her servants, her candles, and ink and parchment. Each item recorded, each line accounted for. The only living proof that she still existed were the expenses tied to her body. In this way, she became a ghost that haunted the treasury, not out of malice, not even out of fear, but out of obligation, because to release her would require answering the question they had long refused to ask. What had she done? It's a question that gains weight with each decade of her confinement, a question that no one seemed willing to speak aloud in court. Perhaps some clerks wondered, quietly, as they copied another expense line about wool blankets, as they wrote another note about a new chambermaid, as they signed off on the purchase of another salter. Perhaps someone, at some point, paused before the ink dried and thought, how do you account for a life lived behind walls when no crime was ever named? Asterisk, the years faded slowly. Eleanor of Brittany passed her 50s, then her 60s, within the same rhythm of controlled stillness. Her life confined, watched, and counted was defined by its repetition. Mornings of prayers and polished silence. Afternoons shadowed by embroidery, permitted walks through walled gardens, and the muted voices of attendants trained not to speak freely in her presence. And at night, behind stone walls and leaded windows, the soft hush of a candle going out before the next day began the same way again. She was still technically Lady Eleanor, but the world had long stopped calling her that, not out of malice, out of forgetfulness. Even in her final decade, there is no record of her complaining. But there is one clue. In 1236, so almost 35 years after she was first taken a payment was recorded for a miniature psalter, a book of psalms, decorated with floral borders and personalized with a modesty initial in gold leaf. Not Eleanor of Brittany, not Lady Eleanor, just one letter, ornamental, symbolic, tucked in the corner of a page. This is the only known possession that bore any trace of her name. Asterisk. It's unlikely she had much else that was truly her own. By that time, the clothing she wore was selected by clerks. Rooms she lived in were maintained by the crown. Even her companions were rotated every few years to prevent the formation of strong bonds or loyalties. That was how Eleanor's captivity was preserved, through managed detachment. And yet, you must ask, what did she think about during those long hours, day after day? Did she remember the Breton coast of her childhood? The sound of seagulls over the port town of Nantes? Did she still carry memories of her brother Arthur before he disappeared forever into the dungeons of Rouen? Or did she forget it all, slowly, as the hours turned into seasons? What remains is this: in 1241, Eleanor of Brittany died at the age of 67. She died in the fortress of Bristol Castle, where she had spent the majority of her adult life. She died, still under watch, still unmarried, still untried, still unreleased. She died in the custody of a crown that had held her for over half a century without once stating its reason. And then, for the first and only time, the English monarchy did something that broke the silence. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, a place reserved for kings and queens. It was not expected. It was not explained. It's the same government that had quietly erased her from public life now granted her one of the greatest honors England could bestow. She was laid to rest near her ancestors, in a stone tomb carved with a figure of a veiled woman holding a book to her chest, perhaps the psalter she once owned. There was no public outcry, no speeches, no apology, just marble and Latin inscriptions, and the question that echoes even louder in that silence: why was she imprisoned for life if, in death, she was deemed worthy of a place among monarchs? There are theories, of course. Some historians suggest that burying her in the abbey was an act of quiet penance by Henry III, who outlived her by several years and perhaps feared divine retribution. Others suggest it was a final attempt to close the book, honor her in death, so no one would question what was done in life. But the truth is more elusive than that, because Eleanor's story is not about justice. It is about maintenance. She was not hated. She was not vilified. She was simply inconvenient, okay? And in a world where power was built on clean lines of succession, a noblewoman with the wrong name at the wrong time was too dangerous to leave unguarded. In the end, Eleanor's story challenges us to think not only about cruelty, but about something more mundane, more chilling: the quiet efficiency of forgetting, the way a society can rationalize lifelong imprisonment without trial, simply because the book's balance and the ledgers remain clean. And so, as you let your thoughts drift and settle, you may find yourself wondering how many others were quietly erased, not with swords or fire, but with ink, wax, and time. Asterisk. The morning fog was stick the day Maria France crossed the border into Champagne. It hung low across the river like a curtain being slowly drawn. Behind her was Aquitaine, and ahead waiting patiently was her future, not in the poetic sense, but in the literal one: the man she would marry, court that would cage her, and the parchment scrolls that had rewritten her fate without ever asking her name. She was 13, and though the treaty called it a wedding, everyone at court knew the truth. This was not a marriage, but a truce. Maria France was the daughter of Louis VII, king, who had once ruled over a vast stretch of territory from the Pyrenees to the Seine. He was the same king who who had been married to Eleanor of Aquitaine till that marriage was annulled, and Eleanor left to marry Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King of England. That decision would tear France in two. Eleanor's dowry included lands so massive that when she left Louis and married Henry, the geography of power shifted. Overnight, France lost almost half its effective reach. England gained not only territory, but strength. Within a few years, Henry II ruled more of France than the French king himself, and in the middle of this quiet storm sat a child named Marie. She was the product of that failed union Louis's daughter by Eleanor, and thus a political reminder of what had been lost. Her presence in court was awkward. 2 English, 4 French nobles. 2 French for the Angevin world her mother now inhabited. A living boundary between 2 angry Thrones. So it was decided she would be married off, not to a man of power, not to a foreign ally, but to a neutral count with enough prestige to hold her and not enough ambition to use her. That man was Henry I, Count of Champagne. A well-positioned noble, loyal to the French crown, but distant from its heart, is a perfect recipient of a political offering. Marie didn't get a choice. She was summoned from her residence near the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had lived in cloistered calm, and escorted with ceremonial dignity across the provinces, not because anyone wanted to honor her, but because appearances mattered. To show weakness to admit that the marriage was a form of diplomatic surrender would be unwise, so the ceremony was grand. There were tapestries and flower petals. As priests read prayers no one listened to. Nobles clapped politely. When the vows were spoken, Marie bowed her head, barely able to see over the altar rail. She was too young to understand most of what was said, but old enough to know she was no longer her own. Her dowry consisted of land parcels and cash promises, but enough to satisfy the count. In return, he offered loyalty to the French crown and promised to keep Marie in conditions appropriate for her birth. But appropriate was a vague word in the 12th century. Marie's life as Countess of Champagne was one of tight schedules and tighter walls. Her husband, though not unkind, was largely indifferent. Their relationship was not based on companionship, but on necessity. He traveled often, fighting in small regional conflicts or attending councils. She stayed behind, managing the household and, eventually, bearing children. What's often overlooked, though, is that Marie did more than just wait. Unlike many traded princesses, she was educated. Her time at Fontevraud had been spent not just in prayer, but in study. She could read Latin and French. She understood canon law. And over time, she began to manage not just her husband's estate, but also his correspondence in diplomatic affairs. She was becoming more than a bride. She was becoming a node of information. But even as she grew into that role, the circumstances of her placement remained clear. She had not been married to raise her status or to reward love. She had been used as a placeholder in the war between 2 empires, a pause button, a human ceasefire, and ceasefires, like treaties, are always temporary. By the time she was 20, her world was shifting again. Her half-brother's children of Henry and Eleanor were carving out dominions of their own. Richard, Geoffrey, John, all of them growing into princes with armies and grievances. Meanwhile, her father, Louis VII, was growing old. His hold on France was weakening. And again, the court began to see Marie not as a woman, but as a diplomatic tool. Could she be moved again? Remarried? Could her children be used in alliances? The court began discussions, but Marie resisted, quietly, politely, and with the kind of intelligence that goes unrecognized in chronicles. She surrounded herself with writers, scholars, and clerics. She opened her estate to poets. She offered patronage to those who had once been silenced in more traditional courts. Over time, Champagne became a strange oasis of learning in a kingdom torn by endless, shifting alliances. But, through it all, She was still the princess who had been traded, still the daughter, Cal, no one had wanted to keep, still the girl whose body had once held the fragile peace between two furious crowns. And as alliances fractured again, and blood once more spilled on French soil, thought began to form one not found in letters or contracts, but in the quiet places where history forgets to look. What happens when a truce grows older than the war it was meant to stop? Marie of France was not supposed to matter beyond the wedding contract that removed her from the royal court. She had done her duty, married the Count of Champagne, secured a regional ally, and quietly birthed a new line of politically useful children. It should have been the end of her story, but it wasn't, because while the men in her life died, went to war, or fell from power, Marie endured. And while others plotted borders and battles, she did something few women in her position dared to do. She took control of her narrative after her husband Henry of Champagne left to fight in the Second Crusade in 1179. Never returned. Marie assumed full control over the county, not in name only, but in real governance. She became regent for her young son Henry II, and for the first time, her position was not ceremonial. It was sovereign. Marie had spent her years at court absorbing everything: the workings of law, the nuances of diplomacy, the slow pulse of tax ledgers and vassal disputes. She had been groomed, perhaps unintentionally, to govern. And when the time came, she did not hesitate, but she did something else. 2. She opened her court to poets, not the sword-rattling bards favored by the Porte Southern courts, but thinkers, writers, and those on the margins. Our court in Champagne became a haven for intellectuals, men and women who composed songs not of war, but of longing, of love, of loss. It was under her protection that Chrétien de Troyes, the famed poet who introduced the story of Lancelot and the Holy Grail, flourished. His tales of Arthurian romance, knights of conflicted honor, and women with voices and agency found fertile ground in Marie's court. It's not an accident. The ideals of courtly love, of passion constrained by duty, mirrored the contours of her own life. Some scholars argue that Marie commissioned these works. Others say she simply gave them room to grow. Either way, her influence was clear. The birth of medieval romance as a literary genre began in the court of a woman who had been traded away, like livestock, and built herself to a patron of myth. But it wasn't just poetry. Marie was also deeply engaged in politics. She wrote letters, dozens of them, to kings, abbots, bishops, and foreign rulers, not as a passive observer, but as a ruler negotiating with equal weight. Her letters were precise, diplomatic, and unusually direct. She did not beg. She proposed. She reasoned. And she made decisions. She mediated disputes between nobles. She oversaw the expansion of ecclesiastical privileges in her lands. She brokered truces between fractious barons. And she maintained Champagne's independence, even as her half-brothers warred over the English and French. This, too, was a kind of resistance, not with swords, but with silence broken in letters, with signatures on parchment, with calculated patronage. Marie did what her station had denied. Her she ruled, and yet, even in her height of influence, she remained marked by the choice made for her at 13. Marriage. That crossing of the river. That moment when she stopped being a daughter and became an offering. She never remarried, not because offers didn't come. Her widowhood made her an even more valuable target for alliance. She refused them all, politely, firmly. She remained the Dowager Countess of Champagne and governed with a subtlety that often left her name missing from the more martial histories. There was one moment, though, when the past reached for her again, in the early 1180s, after the death of her father. Louis VII, a clerical error, listed her as Marie, daughter of Eleanor, Queen of England. It was a reminder that even decades later, her mother's marriage to Henry II still shaped how she was seen, still dragged her back into the geopolitical memory of a split court, a vanished dowry, a broken alliance. Marie did not correct the record publicly, but she did commission new charters under her full title, Marie de France, Countess of Champagne, daughter of Louis of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. It was the most political kind of poetry, a line rewritten not for beauty, but for truth. And in those final years of her life, her children grown, her court celebrated, her land secure, she withdrew, not in shame, but in rhythm, the rhythm of a woman who had given her life to a cause she never chose, but who, in the long shadow of that cause, had made something enduring. Marie of France died in 1198. She was buried in the church of Meaux, not far from the place she had first arrived as a girl, carrying the weight of her parents' failures. There was no war in her name, no revolution, but in the silence of her court, in the ink-stained letters and parchment scrolls, in the verses spoken softly in the stone halls of Champagne, she had altered something deeper than borders. She had survived the role she was forced to play, and she had written herself a new one. Still, in that silence between politics and poetry, a question remains. What does it mean to win when the game was never yours to begin with? It's asterisk. At the end of her life, Marie of France was no longer spoken of in terms of whose daughter she was. Not Eleanor's, not Louis's. She had, through endurance more than defiance, become her own name. Not through dramatic defiance, but through the slower and more persistent force of continuity. She had outlived the king who cast her aside, the mother who left her, the husband who used her to pad his holdings, and the war that made her existence politically useful. And in doing so, she outlasted the very logic that had created her position in the first place. And yet, she was still remembered first and foremost as the daughter used to broker peace. Her legacy is woven into the fabric of medieval European diplomacy, not as a headline, but as a quiet foundation. After her death in 1198, the line she helped establish in Champagne remained one of the most stable, noble branches in France. Her son Henry II of Champagne went on to marry Queen Isabella I of Jerusalem and ruled briefly in the Crusader kingdoms. Her daughters entered convents or smaller noble houses, continuing the work of alliances quietly and without acclaim. But Marie herself did not disappear entirely from memory. The court she built in Champagne left fingerprints on the literature of the next 2 centuries. The ideals of courtly love, the elevation of women as poetic muses, and the culture of noble restraint all trace their institutional roots to her patronage, not because she invented them, but because she chose to give them space, to give them legitimacy, though that so much of what we remember about her is what she enabled in others, the poets, the letters, the policies. The stability to her own inner world remains largely invisible. This is the consequence of being a royal daughter handed over in a time of truce. Every part of her was public property, yet somehow nothing personal remains. Her thoughts on her mother's abandonment, her feelings about her childhood marriage, her thoughts on governance and betrayal of it, left unwritten or unpreserved. What we do know comes from margins. One of the few remaining documents from her hand is a letter written to an abbess of a convent near Troyes, offering both financial support and a request that prayers be said daily for her soul, her children, and curiously for her late mother. It was not a political message, not a declaration, just a quiet note of reconciliation, one that hinted, perhaps, at the lasting ache of being a daughter both claimed and discarded. She lived in a time when treaties were written and marriages and annulments were used to redraw borders. In such a world, daughters were diplomatic tools, not for their voices, but for their wombs, their names, their symbolic weight. Marie learned to use that symbolism as armor. She performed piety when it suited her, patronized when it benefited her court, remained unmarried when remarriage would have cost her autonomy. Every silence she kept was a choice, every gesture a calculation. She turned invisibility into a kind of agency, but even in that quiet strength, one is left with a sense of stillness that clings to her legacy, because Marie of France did not revolt. She did not rewrite law. She did not reclaim a throne. She survived it, and in a world of medieval diplomacy, that was its own kind of rebellion. Her grave is modest, the inscription faded, but the choices she made in life helped shape a version of nobility where women were not only exchanged, but could also quietly influence the story. Still, even as we honor her intelligence, her tact, her contributions to governance and letters, the underlying discomfort remains. Is a quiet victory still a victory when it begins with being traded like property? That's the question Marie never got to answer aloud, but perhaps her entire life was her answer. Asterisk. Before Margaret of Austria had reached her 3rd birthday, her future was sealed in ink, not with crayons or lullabies, but with treaties and titles. She would not grow up in the country where she was born. She would not learn her mother's language. She would not choose her family, her husband, or even her clothing. Instead, she would be sent away as a symbol. Born in 1482, Maximilian, the first of Habsburg, and Mary of Burgundy, Margaret arrived into a Europe swirling with power shifts. The Habsburgs had land but wanted security. The French had ambition but feared encirclement. So, in a moment of rare accord, the two great families struck a truce. The seal of that truce? A 2-year-old girl. In 1482, a treaty was signed at Arras. Among its many clauses, one stood out. Young Margaret would be sent to the French court as the future bride of the Dauphin, Charles the heir to the French throne. It was called a betrothal, but it was really collateral. Margaret was a physical guarantee that her father, Maximilian, wouldn't try to seize back the Burgundian territories recently contested between France and the Empire. She wasn't just engaged, she was insurance. She was shipped off to France not long after the treaty ink dried. Her governesses packed the Habsburg coats of arms in fine chests. Her new wardrobe was selected by French courtiers. She was dressed in silk bonnets, too tight for her small head, taught to curtsy in the French style, and forbidden from speaking Flemish. From the moment she arrived, she belonged to them at first. She lived in the Loire Valley lavish gardens, formal tutors, servants trained to correct every accent. She was raised alongside the young Charles, her betrothed, and for a time they shared a careful childhood. Margaret grew fond of French food, learned court etiquette, began to see France as home. But at the age of 10, her purpose came undone. Charles, now a restless teenager, had different plans. Instead of marrying Margaret as promised, the French court broke the engagement. They annulled the treaty terms and arranged for Charles to marry Anne of Brittany instead, a union that would consolidate more power within France's borders. A better deal. Margaret, after nearly a decade in France, was no longer politically useful, so they sent her back. Asterisk. Not to the life she had before. There was no going back to that, but to a father who had remarried, court she no longer knew, and the family that had moved on without her. She returned to the Habsburg lands as a girl without a place. Not French, not entirely Austrian, not anyone's daughter, not anyone's bride. A child raised for a marriage that never came. Her trousseau was returned unopened, her titles rescinded, her accent mocked. She was just 12. What followed were years of silence, at least in the records. The Habsburg court didn't quite know what to do with her. She was a reminder of a failed diplomatic maneuver, a pawn that had been sacrificed and returned. And her early teenage years passed in a sort of polite obscurity. No grand assignments, no new promises, just waiting until the political winds shifted once more. The Habsburgs needed to secure their influence in Spain and England. This time, Margaret was offered again, this time to Juan, the only son of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, a far better match, politically speaking. So again, she was packed up. Again, she learned a new language, wore new clothes, and was told this was her destiny. Again, her body became a symbol of peace, and this time, the wedding happened. Margaret of Austria became Princess of Asturias, heir apparent to the largest emerging empire in Europe. For a brief moment, she seemed poised to become queen of a new world. But fate, as always, had a different draft in mind. Just 6 months into the marriage, one fell ill and died. And once again, Margaret found herself returned, not to her father this time, but to a broader, heavier burden. A widow at 17. No heir, no home, no identity but the one others had written for her. And so, for the second time in her life, she was sent home in mourning garments. Her legacy, her usefulness, Lion says, shattered once more by decisions made far from where she slept. And yet, even at this young age, a shift was beginning. Something changed in her bearing, in how she walked, in how she answered letters. Even though she had been traded, shipped, and rejected twice, Margaret of Austria was starting to see what no one else had seen in her. She was still on the board, and unlike most pawns, she intended to survive long enough to cross to the other side. Still, one can't help but ask, what is left of a person when every home they've ever known was only rented until the next treaty? Margaret of Austria returned from Spain, not just in mourning clothes, but as a living contradiction. She was 17 and already twice promised, twice displaced. Her first betrothal to France had ended in betrayal. Her second marriage to Juan of Aragon had ended in death. What she carried home with her was more than just grief, was the full weight of a life that had, until now, never belonged to her. And yet, something was changing. She came back different, not in a dramatic way. She didn't renounce her titles or rebel against her family, but in the quiet ways that women of her rank could wield resistance. She began to choose silence instead of compliance, distance instead of deference, and most of all, she began to understand the machinery that had moved her. The Habsburg court, meanwhile, had no intention of letting her rest. Maximilian, her father, was already planning a third marriage for her, this time to Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. Another small but strategic match. Savoy was a buffer territory nestled between rival powers. Pitting on binding it to the Habsburgs through marriage made practical sense. But Margaret didn't want it. Not because Philibert was cruel. He wasn't. In fact, he was said to be handsome and charming, but because she was tired of being passed along like a sealed envelope, was tired of being made into the piece other people wanted, while being given none of her own. She resisted, carefully, strategically, through delays, quiet refusals, and long negotiations. In the end, she was convinced to proceed, but the difference was this. She set conditions. She insisted on keeping her own household, on managing her own dowry, on retaining her own scribes and advisors, and most significantly, she insisted on preserving her own identity. The marriage took place in 1501, and for a brief time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that perhaps this version of life might last. Philibert was kind. He let her govern. He did not interrupt when she read late into the night, or when she spent days arranging the household accounts herself. But fate intervened again in 1504, barely 3 years into their marriage. Philibert died of illness. Margaret was 24, and now a widow for the second time. But this time, something was different. She did not return to her father's court. She did not dress in black and disappear. Instead, she stayed in Savoy, in the household she had organized, among the people she had chosen. She remained Duchess of Savoy in title and practice even, though no law required it. and, for the first time, she governed entirely on her own. The court began to notice. The girl, who had once been passed like a treaty clause, was now issuing policy, writing letters in 6 languages, negotiating debts, forming customs duties, and most notably, refusing all new offers of marriage. Maximilian proposed more matches. A widowed king here, a Spanish archduke there. But Margaret said no, every time, and with each refusal, she consolidated more power. Then came the real turning point in 1507. Her brother, Philip, the fair husband of Juana of Castile, died unexpectedly, leaving the Low Countries in disarray. Juana was unwell, and their son, Charles, was just a child. The Habsburg territories needed a regent, someone trusted, someone competent, someone born of royal blood and proven in administration. Margaret was appointed at 27. The woman who had once been shipped from court to court like a diplomatic parcel was now regent of the Netherlands. She accepted the appointment with characteristic calm. But behind the ceremony, a quiet revolution had taken place. For the first time, Margaret of Austria wasn't being used to secure a kingdom. She was the kingdom as regent. She governed the 17 provinces of the Low Countries with precision. She brokered trade agreements with England. She quelled uprisings in Flanders. She oversaw the rebuilding of cities damaged by war. She restructured taxation to favor infrastructure and commerce. She educated her nephew Charles, who would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. But she never married again. Not because the offer stopped, right? Because she had finally found her role outside of marriage. Her court at Mechlin became a center of learning and diplomacy. Artists visited. Philosophers wrote from her salons. Maps were drawn. Treaties negotiated. Margaret's correspondence reached from Lisbon to Krakow in the span of a decade. She transformed herself from a royal inconvenience to one of the most powerful women in Europe. Still, even in her letters preserved in archives across the continent, there's a tone that never quite fades. A formality, a guardedness. Even when she jokes, it's with a measured restraint. It's as though she never entirely forgot what it felt like to be packed off at 2 years old, then returned like damaged goods at 10, and in quiet moments. No archive can fully capture one, wonders whether she ever allowed herself to be angry, or whether, like so many women of her time, she transmuted that anger into administration, into order, into policy, into silence with structure. Even at the height of her power, she was still remembered by some as the girl rejected by France. But Margaret didn't need to rewrite the story. She had simply outlived it. Still, the question lingers in the spaces her biographers often skip over. Is resilience still resilience when it's built entirely from what others left behind? Asterisk, by the time Margaret of Austria reached her 40s, her name no longer appeared in court gossip columns as a discarded widow or jilted bride. Instead, she was simply referred to as Madame la Grande Gouvernante, the Grand Governess. Not in the domestic sense, but in the full administrative, diplomatic, and symbolic authority of an empire in miniature. From her residence in Mechlin, she governed not as a placeholder, but as a strategist. She ran the Habsburg Netherlands as if it were her own, which, in many ways, it was. And under her regency, the region experienced one of its most stable periods in a century. But Margaret was more than just a competent administrator. She was also a patient architect of Europe's shifting alliances. Her nephew, whom she had raised since he was 6, was poised to inherit a staggering network of titles: Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire. She did not just prepare him for power. She buffered him from its dangers until he was ready to take the reins. She vetted his tutors, managed his early political appearances, and, most crucially, she deflected countless diplomatic arrows that could have damaged his legitimacy. Letters from English and French courts often opened with diplomatic niceties, but closed with personal appeals. Could Madame Margaret intercede? Could she explain the boy's silence? Could she arrange a meeting, a gesture, a compromise? And often she did. Her diplomacy helped preserve fragile treaties that kept the English Channel peaceful and the Iberian Peninsula relatively stable. But she never postured, never claimed to speak for the emperor or the king. She presented herself, always, as the woman holding the reins until such time as the rightful ruler was of age. That, of course, was part of her genius. Asterisk. She never looked like she was taking power, which made her impossible to remove. But power leaves traces, even when quietly held. And for Margaret, those traces weren't just in treaties or court appointments, they were in the buildings, foundations of Mechlin, the expanded harbor works of Antwerp, the canals improved for grain shipments, the orphanages funded from her personal dowry, the universities whose students were educated on stipends that bore her wax seal. All these spoke louder than any throne. Yet, despite her skill, there was always one limitation she could not shake. She was still a woman in a patriarchal world. Her authority, while immense, was conditional. It was only hers because Charles allowed it. And so, even as she ruled well into her 50s, there was always the sense that she was a steward, not a sovereign. In 1520, Charles was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. He had reached his majority long before, but this act marked a turning point. The regency, technically speaking, was no longer necessary. Margaret could have stepped back. She did. Charles asked her to remain as governor of the Netherlands a post she accepted, not because she needed the power, but because she had created the stability that allowed his empire to function in the first place, and because she knew, in some deep, quiet way, that leaving would unravel the web she had spent decades spinning. But time was not on her side. The political world was changing. Protestantism was rising. Trade was shifting. France was again pressing on the Habsburg border, and the calm she had maintained in the Low Countries was beginning to fray at the edges. She responded the only way she knew how, by tightening control. More decrees, more correspondence, more negotiations. But her health was fading. By 1530, Margaret began withdrawing from daily affairs. She had always been meticulous, her handwriting elegant, her margins even, but her letters grew shaky. She delegated more, spoke less, attended fewer court events, and then, on December 1st, 1530, at the age of 50, Margaret of Austria died following complications from a leg infection. It is said that she refused a risky operation, reportedly saying, "I am old enough to die, and have had enough of life." She was buried in Bergen-Bresse beside her second husband, Philibert of Savoy. Her choice, not the court's. On her tomb, their two effigies lie side by side, hands clasped in stone. Below them, a second pair of sculptures shows their skeletal remains, carved in haunting detail, skin pulled tight, bones jutting through. It was Margaret's idea. She had commissioned it as a double tomb, reminder of both love and death, but perhaps also of transparency, of the truth beneath all the velvets and treaties. That every alliance ends, that every pawn, no matter how finely clothed, is mortal. Her legacy did not end with her burial. She had trained a generation of diplomats, raised an emperor, stabilized a region torn between rival crowns. But most importantly, she had rewritten the role of a royal daughter by refusing to let her value end with marriage. And even now, centuries later, her story asks the same quiet, comfortable question. What does it mean when the most powerful woman in Europe was still considered only a regent? Asterisk. In the pale morning light of October 1548, the harbor at Dumbarton was cloaked in fog. The cold wind came in sharp off the water, and the small crowd gathered at the dock did not speak above whispers. At the center of this hush stood a 5-year-old girl dressed in layers, far too heavy for her size, her gloved hands clasped around a rosary she had been told to hold tightly. Her name was Mary Stuart, and she was about to be shipped to France not as a passenger, but as a bride. Scotland was in crisis. King James V had died the year before, leaving behind a kingdom on the edge of collapse and an infant daughter Marius, his only legitimate heir. At just 6 days old, she became Queen of Scots. But a crown on an infant's head is not protection. It's an invitation to schemes, to foreign influence, to war, and war had already come. The English, under Edward VI, had launched a campaign known bitterly as the Rough Wooing, an effort to force a marriage between young Queen Mary and the boy King of England. It was not romance, it was conquest, disguised as diplomacy. English troops razed towns, burned monasteries, took nobles hostage. The goal was simple, to bring Scotland under English control through marriage. But Scotland, historically tangled between stronger neighbors, had another option: France. In the 16th century, the old alliance between France and Scotland was more than just sentiment to a survival. France offered protection, money, soldiers, and in exchange, they wanted a queen. Specifically, they wanted Mary Stuart to marry the French Dauphin, Francis. And so, at the age of 5, Mary was placed on a ship bound for a future she could not yet pronounce, not because she had chosen it, but because she was the most valuable piece on the Scottish board. A living treaty. She was not alone. A group of Scottish noble children, later known as the Four Marys, were sent with her companions, and political safeguards in equal measure. They were all little girls, all from prominent families, all dressed in matching cloaks to symbolize unity, loyalty, and most of all, containment. The voyage to France was stormy. The sea was unkind, and the children were sick for days. They arrived. They were taken not to a quiet residence, but to a series of French palaces, because their presence was not privateer, was a statement, a declaration that France had not only outmaneuvered England, but secured a queen in the process. Mary's arrival at the French court was carefully staged. Trumpets, silks, welcoming ceremonies. But behind the pomp was an unspoken truth. She was not just a guest. She was collateral. From the moment she stepped onto French soil, she was treated not as a visiting monarch, but as a future duchess. Her education was overseen by Catherine de' Medici herself, the sharp-eyed queen consort of Henry II. Mary learned French, Latin, Italian. She was instructed in dancing, falconry, needlework, and Catholic catechism. She was praised for her intelligence, her poise, her beauty. Even as a child, she was tall and elegant, with auburn hair and a solemn gaze that made her seem older than she was. But it wasn't praise freely given, it was expectation fulfilled, because France had invested in her. They had paid for her passage, paid to protect her from England, paid to raise her as their own. And in return, they would shape her. She was betrothed to the Dauphin, Francis, almost immediately upon arrival. A boy nearly her age, delicate in health and shy by temperament. He was the son of power, but not the embodiment of it. That would be Mary's role, to support him, amplify him, and if needed, anchor him. In private. Some courtiers whispered doubts. She was too clever, too popular, too well-spoken for a bride expected to defer. But publicly, the image held. The Scottish queen, raised in France, destined to become French royalty, and back in Scotland, she was slowly forgotten. The regency continued under Mary of Guise, her mother, who tried to maintain control through French backing and constant negotiation. But the country was restless. Protestant reformers were gaining ground. English influence kept returning through spies, coins, and promises of protection. Queen, who grew up abroad, who could not even speak Gaelic or Scots, by the age of 10, began to feel more like an idea than a leader. Still, in France, the project continued. Mary was molded with precision. Her handwriting was impeccable, her courtly manners flawless, her every movement rehearsed. At banquets, she sat just below the royal family, but never quite among them. She was always visible, always admired, never free. She would write poetry in French lines that hinted at a young mind watching everything, processing the world around her in metaphors and metaphysical questions. But even her writing was filtered. Courtiers read it. Teachers shaped it. She was praised for being obedient, for not asking too many questions. But she had questions. She once asked her tutor, why queens must always be married as children. He responded that the affairs of nations are too important to delay. She never asked again. And so, year after year, the plan held. Mary was raised not to be Scottish, but to be useful. And in 1558, at age 15, the wedding took place. Mary, Queen of Scots, became the wife of the French Dauphin. She wore a gown of white satin, pearls in her hair, a diamond-encrusted belt around her waist that had been commissioned by the French crown itself. And the very next year, her new husband became King Francis II. Mary was now Queen of two kingdoms, Scotland by birth, France by marriage. But she was still not free, not in her choices, not in her voice, not in her movements, because the girl who had been sent across the sea at 5 had never truly stopped being a hostage. She had simply learned to smile for the part. And now, as Queen of France, one question hovered behind every curtain, every polished floor, every ceremony. If a queen is raised as a subject of another court, does she ever truly belong to her own? Mary Stuart had become Queen of France at 16, but by 17, she was a widow. Francis II died in December of 1560, barely a year into his reign, after a painful illness that drained the boy king of what little strength he had. A court that had once embraced Mary so theatrically turned quiet. Plans shifted, alliances frayed. Catherine de' Medici, now regent for her younger son Charles IX, reasserted control. And Mary, she was suddenly inconvenient again. Without Francis, she was no longer Queen of France in any meaningful way. She had no children, no regency, no legitimate claim, and worst of all for Franchi, was still technically Queen of Scots, which meant she was now a free agent, a variable, a risk. There were whispers, of course, about marrying her off again, perhaps to a French noble to retain influence in Scotland, perhaps to a Spanish cousin to draw her into Catholic diplomacy. But Mary had grown up during these whisperings. She understood their meaning. She saw her reflection in the polished stone walls of the Louvre and recognized the pattern. She was once again a treaty waiting to be signed. But this time, she refused. She made the decision to return to Scotland. It wasn't what anyone expected. France was her home. Scotland was a country she hadn't seen since she was 5 years old. She spoke French better than Scots. She had lived in castles, read Roman poets, dined with kings. But she was determined. And in the summer of 1561, at just 18 years old, she boarded a ship across the same sea that had once stolen her childhood. The voyage back was not ceremonial. There were no trumpets. The French court was glad to see her go. The Scottish nobility was wary of her return, and the people, those who had once cheered for her as an infant, now knew her only as a foreigner. When Mary stepped ashore at Leith, the skies were gray and the city was somber. Edinburgh had changed. Protestant reformers, led by men like John Knox, had appended the Catholic foundations of the realm. The monasteries were crumbling. The Mass was outlawed, and Mary educated in Catholic France, devout, elegant, and continental in every habit, seen as both a monarch and a threat. She tried to bridge the divide. She held court in both French and Scots. She allowed Protestant ministers in her council. She publicly declared she would not force her religion on others as long as she could practice her own. But the suspicion didn't lift, because Mary brought more than just Catholicism with her. She brought France. She brought silks and perfumes and etiquette. She wore mourning veils and pale gowns. She read poetry and played the lute. Her ladies-in-waiting, the four Marys, dressed like noble women of Paris. They laughed in foreign tongues. They walked too gracefully through muddy Scottish courtyards, and the people noticed too many. She wasn't their queen. She was a guest, a royal figurehead, trained in the customs of another world. But Mary was determined to rule. And, for a time, she did. She held regular councils. She corresponded with European powers. She inspected border defenses. She rode on horseback to visit nobles in the north. She learned the names of her vassals. She even walked the narrow winds of Edinburgh Castle, alone asking questions of the guards and servants in Scots that carried the soft rhythms of France. But always, she remained slightly apart. Her half-brother, Lord James Stuart, advised her carefully. John Knox criticized her openly. And in the midst of it all, Mary was constantly aware that every decision she made was weighed against what people feared about her. That she was too Catholic, too foreign, too feminine to hold power in a country where nobles ruled with swords and sermons. She was not naive. She understood the need for an heir, a husband, a stronger position. And so, after months of deliberation, she married again, this time to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was meant to be a union that strengthened her claim, united rival houses, and produced a child. But it unraveled almost immediately. Darnley was arrogant, unstable. He drank. He fought. He demanded to be made king in name, not just by marriage. And he saw Mary not as a partner, but as a vessel for legitimacy, for control, for power he could not earn on his own. Mary's patience thinned, and when she became pregnant in 1565, tensions only worsened. Darnley, threatened by her closeness to her secretary, David Rizzio, took part in Rizzio's brutal murder in front of the pregnant queen. It was a moment that shattered something. The girl who had once held her rosary on the docks of Tuscany, Barton, had grown into a woman who could not escape violence in her own chambers, even in her own marriage. And yet, she gave birth to a healthy son, James, a future king, a hope, perhaps, that her long journey had not been in vain. But peace did not follow. Within a year, Darnley was dead, killed in a mysterious explosion outside a house in Kirkhofield. And though Mary was never proven to be involved, the court of public opinion quickly turned when she married the chief suspect, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell's. Then 3 months later, her enemies moved swiftly. The nobles revolted. She was captured, imprisoned, forced to abdicate. Her son, barely 1-year-old, was crowned in her place. Her titles stripped, her power erased. The foreign queen was no longer even queen, and as she sat in a tower beside the cold waters of Loch Leven, her hair unbound, her hands bare, she might have remembered that day at the harbor when she first left for France. She was still a child, still a symbol of hope and peace. Now she was neither. Only a question remained. Can a woman raised to serve 2 kingdoms ever belong to either, when neither chose her for who she was? Asterisk. Mary Stuart's fall from the Scottish throne was not marked by a single battle, but by a slow unraveling threads pulled loose by distrust, betrayal, and the quiet machinery of those who had never fully accepted her. And in 1567, when she was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, it seemed that her story had reached its final act. But Mary was not finished. She had been sent away as a child, crowned young, widowed once, betrayed by her second husband, stripped of cod, her crown by her own nobles. And now she was a prisoner in her own land. And yet, just 1 year after her imprisonment, she escaped. It was May 1568. Disguised, perhaps even aided by a sympathetic guard, Mary fled Lochleven under the cover of early morning mist. Supporters rallied. Nobles, who had once wavered, declared themselves in her favor. A small army gathered for the first time in her life. Mary tried to take power not through marriage or inheritance, but with force. But it wasn't enough. At the Battle of Langside, her forces were defeated, her supporters scattered, and Mary made a fateful decision, one shaped less by strategy than by desperation. She fled south to England, to Elizabeth. It was, in many ways, the most ironic move of her life. The child once groomed as a Catholic queen to counter English Protestantism now sought protection from the very monarch whose crown she had once been said to threaten. She wrote letters, pleaded her case, asked for a personal meeting. But Elizabeth did not respond with open arms. She responded with caution, because Mary wasn't just a fugitive queen. She was a dynastic threat. She was Elizabeth's cousin, and under Catholic succession laws, she had a legitimate claim to the English throne. And in the eyes of many English Catholics, she wasn't just a cousin. She was the rightful queen. So Elizabeth, unwilling to risk rebellion, ordered Mary held, not as a criminal, not as an enemy, but as a guest who would not be allowed to leave. Mary was moved from one grand estate to another Carlisle castle. Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, residence. Beautiful, yes, but fortified, guarded, restrictive. She was attended by servants, allowed to correspond, permitted to ride. But her life was no longer her own. Once again, Mary was a prisoner dressed in velvet. Her letters were read, her visitors monitored, her food tasted, and year after year, she watched the world pass her by from behind windows lined with leaded glass. But she did not go quietly. She plotted, not always directly, sometimes through subtle signs, sometimes through hopeful words and coded letters, sometimes through couriers who pledged loyalty to the old religion. Over the years, several Catholic uprisings in England, the Northern Rebellion, the Ridolfi plot hinted at support for Mary as queen. Whether she was involved in planning them remains debated, but the threat was real, and eventually her correspondence caught up with her in 1586. The Babington plot was uncovered a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Letters were found, ciphered, intercepted, and decoded. One of them bore Mary's secret seal. It was enough. In 1587, after 19 years in English captivity, Mary Stuart was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. The execution was staged at Fothering Castle. On the morning of February 8th, she dressed with care, a black gown over a scarlet petticoat symbolizing martyrdom. She walked into the chamber where a wooden block awaited her, flanked by nobles and witnesses, many of whom had never seen her before. She spoke calmly, forgave her executioner, prayed aloud in Latin. The axe fell not cleanly, but clumsily. It took 3 strikes, and with that, the girl once sent to France as a royal child of peace, who had returned as a queen and fallen as a prisoner, was finally silenced. But history did not forget her, because Mary Stuart became something larger in death than she had ever been in life. A martyr to some, a tragic warning to others. Her story was told and retold by poets, pamphleteers, painters, not always accurately, but always with fascination. And for centuries, her name lingered on the edge of politics and art, myth, and memory. In a way, she had finally become what every court had once tried to make her, a symbol, not of peace, not of power, but of the cost of being born into royalty with a womb and a claim, because Mary had done everything her rank demanded, married, when told, bore heirs, forged alliances, held court, and still she died a prisoner. And even now, okay, her life leaves us wondering if every step is taken for duty, but none lead to safety. Was the path ever hers to walk? Asterisk. The year was 1589, and the sea was restless in the harbors of Copenhagen. Galleons groaned under the weight of dowries and gift bells of silk, barrels of salted fish, bolts of wool from the looms of Zealand. All of it destined not for trade, but for ceremony, not for markets, but for marriage. And at the center of this carefully orchestrated departure stood a girl of 16, Anna of Denmark, or rather, Anne, as she would be known in the English tongue. She would soon be forced to master. Her face, framed by a lice-trimmed coif, was solemn but calm. Her hands, gloved and still, rested at her sides. Round her, courtiers busied themselves with final farewells. Behind her, the Danish court swelled with the proud silence of reluctant surrender, because Anne was leaving, not for travel, but for transfer. She was to be sent to Scotland, and she was not coming back. Her marriage had been arranged years earlier, in the brittle aftermath of the Reformation, when Protestant kingdoms sought to stabilize themselves with careful unions. James, 6 of Scotland, young, bookish, and newly come of age, needed a wife, and Denmark, stable and devoutly Lutheran, was eager to deepen Protestant alliances across the North Sea. It was a match shaped less by romance than by maps. The bride and groom had never met, and in truth, there had been some debate over whether Anne or her sister Elizabeth would be chosen. In the end, Anne, more demure, less politically assertive, was preferred. So, Anne was made ready. She was educated in the basics of courtly English, instructed in her new role, trained in the ceremonial gestures expected of a queen consort, and then, with little ceremony of her own choosing, she was put aboard ship and sent away. But the journey did not go as planned. The North Sea, ever volatile, in October, turned violent. Storms battered the fleet. Some ships turned back, others were lost. Anne's own vessel was forced to land on the coast of Norway safe, far from her destination. Word of her failed arrival reached James weeks later, and in a rare act of personal resolve, the Scottish king surprised everyone. He sailed to fetch her himself. It was not typical for kings to do such things, but James, eager to show himself decisive, and perhaps charmed by the prospect of rescuing his bride, crossed the stormy waters with a small fleet, met Anne in Oslo, and married her. There, in a Lutheran ceremony, far from either of their courts. It was, by all accounts, an awkward but sincere union. They were both young. James was 23, and just 15. He was scholarly, verbose, uncomfortable with the touch. She was quiet, unaccustomed to the harsh language of Scots court. But there was affection, or at least a shared willingness to begin. When they finally returned to Scotland in 1590, Anne was crowned in Holyrood Abbey. But from the very first, her role was shaped not by her desires, but by what others expected of her. She was a queen consorta, positioned both grand and powerless. Her body was her chief currency, her womb, her chief service. She was expected to give James heirs, sons, if possible, and to do so without questioning the political theology of his reign. But Anne had ambitions of her own, not bold ones, not reckless, but real. She wanted her own household, own court, her own relationship with the world beyond Scotland's chilly stone halls. And that's when things became difficult, because in the royal household of 16th century Scotland, every purse was accounted for, and every chamber watched. James, keen to centralize control, did not appreciate Anne's desire for autonomy. He wanted her silent, decorative, obedient. She, however, had been raised among the proud Norwegian courts, where royal women held influence and managed estates, where queens could act as intercessors, diplomats, and patrons in their own right, and did not understand why her petitions were dismissed, why her letters were intercepted, why her household appointments were overridden by James's advisors, and she especially did not understand why. When she gave birth to their first son, Prince Henry, the child was taken from her. It was Scottish custom, James said. Royal children were raised in separate households under the watchful eye of noble guardians. But still a girl herself felt this as a profound rejection. She had done what was asked, borne the heir, endured the pain, fulfilled her duty, and then the child was removed from her arms. She wrote letters, pleaded to see him, but James, aloof and consumed with matters of theology and governance, stood firm. The separation cut deep, and from this wound, a quiet resentment began to grow. Anne began surrounding herself with ladies of her own choosing, many from Denmark, others from England. She commissioned tapestries, opened correspondence with artists, and began building a court miniature within her own chambers. And slowly, the queen, who had once arrived as a political afterthought, began crafting a world of her own. But always, the child was absent, and that absence would come to define the next decade of her life, because Anne of Denmark would become a mother several times, 6 children in all, though only 3 were survived to adulthood. Each time she was separated from them, each time she asked to be more than just a vessel, and each time she was reminded of her station, not ruler, not partner, not mother, but queen consort. There were no rebellions, no grand protests, no defiant speeches, just a series of silent sacrifices, of letters never answered, of corridors where her voice was not welcomed, of a crown worn, but never allowed to weigh anything of consequence. And still, the years passed. Eventually, Anne's husband would ascend to the English throne, becoming James I of England after Elizabeth's death in 1603. And with this shift came new pressures, new palaces, and a new land to navigate. Anne would follow him there and build a strange, almost theatrical court of her own in England. She would dabble in masks, sponsor painters, and become a patron of artists and playwrights. But she would never again ask for a child back. That part of her was buried beneath layers of silk, beneath the rituals of foreign courts, beneath the quiet knowledge that she had been sold not for love, but for peace, and that peace between Protestant kingdoms, between rival courts, had demanded a cost: her youth, her voice, her claim to even the smallest piece of maternal joy. And so, we ask, if a queen is told her body belongs to diplomacy, but her children to the crown, does anything remain that is truly hers? Asterisk. By the time Anne of Denmark arrived in England in 1603, the Thames was thick with the stench of expectancy. Elizabeth I was dead, the Tudor line extinguished. The streets of London, nervous but giddy, swelled with curious faces, girt to glimpse the new queen. To hear her speak, to read in her gestures what sort of future this foreign woman might bring. But Anne was exhausted. She had just endured a decade in Scotland land. She had never truly come to call her own. Now she was expected to become the mother of a united crown, the bridge between English and Scottish factions, the emblem of Protestant harmony, a figurehead. Peace offering. Her arrival was not triumphant. It was ceremonial. James, now styled James I of England and Vi of Scotland, had taken to his English throne with theological enthusiasm. He lectured Parliament, he scribbled treatises, he debated divine right with the fervor of a man convinced of his sacred appointment. Anne watched from the sidelines. She was no longer the foreign consort of a peripheral monarchy. She was now Queen of England, Ireland, and Scotland. But her status remained unchanged. She was still denied real political influence. Her letters to her family in Denmark were filtered. Her requests for funds were subject to scrutiny. Even her faith was examined. Anne had never converted to Presbyterianism. Raised a Lutheran, she had quietly maintained certain private practices, prayers in Latin, respect for sacraments, that skirted the line between Protestant orthodoxy and Catholic tradition. In England, this ambiguity was dangerous, so she played a subtle game in public. She attended Anglican services. In private, she maintained a chapel that critics whispered was far too ornate. She hired Catholic musicians. She welcomed recusant courtiers into her inner circle. She never proclaimed her beliefs aloud, but she made it clear that they were her own. It was not rebellion, it was preservation. James, meanwhile, treated her increasingly as a fixture. He preferred the company of his male favorites, young, spoken courtiers like Robert Carr and George Villiers, who flattered the king's intellect and eased his loneliness. Anne was no longer needed for companionship. She had given James children. She had walked beside him in coronation processions. Now, she was expected to fade gracefully into the embroidered tapestries of court life. But Anne refused to disappear. She began building her own cultural empire. Using her position as queen, she became an active patron of the arts. She sponsored Inigo Jones, the famed architect, and supported Ben Jonson, the playwright. She hosted masques, slavish performances filled with music, dance, and allegory that subtly reasserted her agency in these performances, and often played roles herself. She would appear as a goddess, a nymph, a spirit of peace, draped in robes of silver and blue, her crown glinting beneath candlelight. She would move across the stage not as a consort, but as a sovereign presence. These masks were not just entertainments. They were acts of quiet resistance. Through allegory and costume, Anne crafted a version of herself that English politics would never allow a queen with voice, vision, and authority. And while James was consumed with treaties and theological quarrels, Anne created a sanctuary of elegance and thought just beyond his reach. Her court became known for its refinement. Her influence on fashion was immense. French ruffs, Italian velvets, Spanish silks, all of it filtered through Anne's wardrobe. London tailors followed her choices. Nobles mimicked her gowns, but none of it gave her real power. She could stage a mask, but not draft policy. She could influence trends, but not appointments. Even in her private life, her choices were limited. Her attempts to raise her children were thwarted by tradition. The surviving sons, Henry and Charles, were taken from her again and again, placed with tutors, raised under surveillance, prepared for kingship without the warmth of their mothers. Presence.N wrote letters, sometimes tearful, sometimes formally requesting more time with them. The answers were often perfunctory. Henry, her eldest, was a figure of immense promise, charismatic, athletic, intellectually precocious. Doted on him, and in him she saw a chance to nurture a future, unlike James's monarch of vigor, not scripture, a prince of action. But that hope would be short-lived in 1612. Henry fell ill, a fever, followed by a decline. Physicians bled him, dosed him, whispered of plague or typhoid. Nothing worked. At the age of 18, Prince Henry died. Anne was inconsolable. She shut herself in her apartments, dressed in black, refused to speak to James for weeks. For the first time, the English court glimpsed her grief, not as a queen, but as a mother. The court moved on. James immersed himself in policy. Charles, now the heir, was groomed in Henry's place, but Anne never recovered fully. She continued her masks, continued her letters, continued to perform a version of royalty that masked her sorrow. But the glitter had dulled. Her political invisibility, once tolerable, now felt like erasure. Her motherhood, once ceremonial, now felt like a hollow title. She was still queen, but of what? Not of counsel, not of her children, not of her beliefs. And yet, she persisted. In 1616, she purchased the Somerset House of Grand London residence. She renamed it Denmark House, a small but pointed assertion of identity. She remodeled its halls, hung Danish tapestries, and hosted salons that merged English and continental tastes. It was not a rebellion, but it was a reclaiming. Denmark House became a court within a court, a place where Catholic musicians played under the gaze of a Protestant state, where poets whispered satire, where women discussed literature and grief, and of Denmark, its denied voice in matters of state, had built a republic of the mind. And so, we are left to wonder, when a woman is exiled by marriage, silenced by politics, and erased by grief what remains of her voice, how loudly must it echo in silk, song, and sorrow to be heard. Asterisk, as the winter of 1618 deepened over England, the chill that settled in the royal chambers of Denmark House seemed more than seasonal. Anne of Denmark, Queen of England, Ireland, and Scotland, began to withdraw. At first, it was subtle. She appeared less frequently at court events. Her presence at church already, a political question, grew increasingly rare. The masques she once sponsored with such theatrical splendor slowed to a hush. And behind the thick doors of her private apartments, whispers of illness began to spread. Some said it was melancholy. Others spoke of gout, or a lingering fever that would not lift. But those close to her understood that Anne was not merely unwell. She was tired. Not in body alone, but in spirit. The years had taken much. A homeland she could never return to freely. Children she could never fully raise. A role she could never control. In early 1619, her condition worsened. Physicians were summoned, men of learning, of leeches, of bitter tonics, and muttered prayers. Their efforts were as ceremonial as her crowns had been. Neither had much power. Anne knew this. She had long lived with pageantry as a substitute for power. Her body now became another stage, one that slipped beyond her control. She requested fewer visits. She instructed her servants to read poetry to her, and when she could no longer read, she simply listened, drifting between sleep and silence, her mind turning inward. On March 2nd, 1619, she died at Hampton Court Palace. She was 44 years old, the queen who had been married off at 15 to unify Protestant Europe, the queen who had been passed from one throne to another like the seal on a wax envelope, the queen who had built her own silent court of music and metaphor, was gone. The news reached James quickly. His response, by most accounts, was restrained. Some said he grieved in private. Others said he barely paused his royal business. They had grown apart in life. In death, their connection remained a matter of record, more than sentiment. Charles, her remaining son, now Prince of Wales, was devastated. He had known his mother not through long maternal talks or daily intimacy, but through letters, distant affection, and the flicker of presence in cold palaces. And yet, he had admired her resolve, her taste, her intellect. In many ways, Charles would carry forward Anne's cultural legacy more than James ever had. The funeral was grand. As expected, black drapes, white horses, slow processions, Latin prayers in echoing chapels, courtiers weeping with the correctness expected of their station. What the woman buried that day had long ago ceased being the queen they mourned in a symbolic touch. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey, but not beside James. Instead, she was placed in Henry VII's chapel, a subtle distance from the man who had been both her partner and her warden. She had never been a queen in power, but in death, she was a sovereign of something quieter, of design, of resistance, of stillness in the face of spectacle. Her legacy unfolded not through proclamations, but through architecture and art. Denmark House would become the nucleus of a certain English eleganza, merging of continental design and British restraint. Her patronage of Inigo Jones would lead to the evolution of Palladian architecture in England. Her taste would help define the aesthetic of a generation. She was, in the truest sense, a cultural architect, and her quiet subversions, her choice of Catholic musicians, her ambiguous religious practices, her staging of allegorical masks would become whispered examples of how women navigated power when power was denied them. Even her masks, once dismissed as frivolous entertainments, are now read by historians as coded political statements. Beneath the layers of silk and allegory, there was often a message, a goddess cast aside, a queen reborn as wisdom, a mother speaking through symbols, because no one would hear her voice directly in a world where royal women were used to secure peace, pay debts, and produce heirs. Anne of Denmark had demanded something more, not loudly, not through revolt, but through presence, through taste, through the assertion that her thoughts, her body, her grief, and her silence mattered. And so we return to the question with which her life leaves us. When the only power left to you is symbolic, can symbolism become power? Asterisk, you are 9 years old. The world is made of velvet and silver, buckles and heavy tapestries with strange birds sewn into them. You don't understand half of what is happening, but everyone is smiling too widely. And the priest keeps saying your name. You are Isabella of Valois. You are a French princess. And today, in 1396, you are getting married. The groom is King Richard II of England. He is 29. In another century, another world, this moment would be unthinkable. A child and a man decades apart. But in the cold calculations of medieval diplomacy, your age is not a factor. You are not a child in this equation. You are a pledge, a treaty, a bargaining chip dressed in brocade, to understand why you were married off before you had finished growing. One must step back now into your nursery, but into the burnt and bitter soil of the 100 Years' War. England and France have been fighting for more than half a century. Asterisk kings died, fields burned, fortunes shifted, and the war dragged on, not out of any noble cause, but out of obligation and inertia. Both kingdoms were tangled in claims of inheritance, pride, and revenge. By the 1390s, it had become clear that neither side could win outright. Peace was necessary. But peace had to be symbolic. It had to be visible. And nothing was more visible than a wedding. Richard II, widowed after the death of his first queen, Anne of Bohemia, was looking for a political solution wrapped in ceremony. Asterisk. And Charles VI of France, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost to madness, agreed to offer one of his daughters as the price of peace. He chose you. You were too young to understand the treaty, but the scribes understood it, as did the courtiers. So did the bishops, who smiled tightly during the procession, and the nobles, who murmured approval as they watched a girl no taller than their belt. Buckles pledged herself to a grown man. The marriage was unconsummated, as if that detail somehow softened the politics of it. Everyone emphasized that point. She is too young, they whispered, but the king will wait. The marriage is symbolic, they said, a gesture, a promise wrapped in silk, and yet the child was still sent across the channel, still placed into English court life, still separated from her family, her language, her rhythms of childhood. Were placed in the care of the dowager queen and kept in luxury a golden cage, draped in foreign etiquette. Some days, you missed your mother. Other days, you were too busy learning how to smile, just so, how to curtsy, how to answer questions in English, even though the words felt jagged in your mouth. You practiced walking without looking down. You learned when to be silent, always silent. It was a lonely kind of education, not in books, but in performance. No one hit you. No one starved you. But you were disciplined by arrangement, by the awareness that everything you were was tied to politics. And all the while, King Richard, your symbolic husband, treated you with what historians call kindness, though it's hard to define. What kindness means in this context. He gave you gifts. He wrote you letters when he traveled. But he also left you behind often, attending to the delicate fractures of his realm. He was a deeply insecure monarch caught between his nobles and his legacy. And you were simply another symbol in his court. To most, the marriage had worked. The Treaty of Lullingham, signed alongside your wedding, brought temporary peace between England and France. There were ceremonies, banquets, public parades of joy. People cheered as if the war had ended for good. But peace rooted in symbolic unions is rarely stable. The truce would last only a few years, and your presence, so grand at first, would soon become a political problem, because the king who married you, the one meant to wait until you grew, would be deposed before your 12th birthday in 1399. Everything changed. Richard II, accused of tyranny and surrounded by enemies, was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who would become Henry IV. Richard was arrested, imprisoned, and though the official story remains cloudy almost, certainly murdered. You, Isabella, were suddenly no longer queen. Not a widow, not a wife, not even a guest, just a foreign child in the court of the man who had killed your husband. What happened next was not entirely cruel, but it was deeply impersonal. Henry insisted that you should remain in England. He offered to marry you to his son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V. He claimed this was a gesture of continuity, a way to preserve the peace. But your family in France refused. They demanded your return. For 2 years, you remained in England, caught in a silent war. No longer a bride, not yet free, just a girl watching the political tides shift from a window to high to touch. And through it all, you remained quiet, elegant, composed, a princess trained for performance. But what did you think? What went through your mind as the language around you shifted from reverent to indifferent? Did you long for home? Did you wonder what it meant to be a queen 1 year and a forgotten bargaining tool the next? And how, exactly, does a 12-year-old process being widowed before she ever had a voice in her life? That's the question history doesn't answer, not in its chronicles, nor its treaties. It tells us what happened, okay? But it cannot tell us what it felt like. Perhaps that's the true silence that surrounds Isabella of Valois. A silence louder than war. Asterisk. You were finally allowed to go home in the year 1401. It had been 2 years since Richard was deposed. 2 years of watching the English court change around you, its loyalties remade like fabric, re-dyed in another color. 2 years of being watched closely, respectfully, suspiciously by the new regime that had removed your husband, replaced your place in court with silence. You were 12. Your brother-in-law, Henry IV, had delayed your return for as long as he could. He had hoped to keep you as a political tool. A girl of noble blood, royal by marriage, perhaps even a future queen again if he could bind you to his son. But France had grown restless. Your mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, wrote letter after letter. Ambassadors pleaded. It was clear that the English no longer had legitimate reason to hold you. The treaty had collapsed. Richard was dead. The truce was, once again, only words, so they let you go. There was no parade, no ceremony. You did not depart with the Queen's dignity, but rather with the quiet resignation of a cargo returned. Crossed the channel in a small flotilla. Your retainers thinner now. Your influence vanished, and when you arrived at the French court again, you were no longer the child they had sent away. You had grown taller. Your voice was steadier, but more than anything, you were silent in a way that unnerved them. Something had been lost at sea, not during the voyage home, but during your exile. Something private, something unspoken. In France, there was relief that you were safe, but also uncertainty. What should they do with you now? You had been a queen. You had worn the title, even if only ceremonially. You had represented France on foreign soil. You had lived through a diplomatic marriage that had unraveled into political bloodshed. And now, at just 13, you were neither widow, nor bride, nor pawn. You were a problem. and problems had to be solved quickly at court. For a brief time, you were allowed to grieve. There were public declarations of your piety, of your loyalty to the memory of Richard II. But soon enough, the offers began to arrive. New marriages, new arrangements. You were barely out of childhood, and already the court was arranging your future again, like furniture in a too-small room. The politics of dowry and diplomacy never paused, and you were still valuable not because of who you were, but because of what you symbolized. Your next marriage would be to Charles, Duke of Orleans, a boy not much older than you. He was 11, and yet, for all its awkwardness, this match was considered more appropriate. You were French, he was French. The dowries and lands stayed within the realm, and more importantly, King's family was entangled in the rising tension between rival French factions, particularly the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Marrying you into the Orleans line was not about healing kingdoms anymore. It was about positioning yourself in the coming French Civil War. You were not yet aware of it, but France was slipping into chaos. The king, your father, Charles VI, was suffering from worsening bouts of mental instability. During these episodes, he would forget who he was, fail to recognize his children, and run through the palace screaming that he was made of glass. When loose head, he ruled with gentleness, but when lost to madness, others ruled in his name. And so, your marriage to Charles of Orleans was arranged swiftly. It's a preemptive strike in the court's quiet war over influence. This marriage was different. From the first, there were no English eyes on you now. No, it's a foreign tongue to twist. This was your homeland, your language, but still, not your choice. You were 16 when the marriage was formally celebrated, old enough to understand the implications, old enough to know that affection would not be part of the arrangement. Charles was a child. He had not yet grown into the kind of man who could anchor a kingdom or even a household. And yet, he was gentle, polite, more like a younger brother than a husband. There was something painfully quiet about the years that followed. You had wealth again, status, a household of your own, but you did not have peace. France was beginning to tear itself apart. Assassinations, ambushes, political violence disguised as ceremonial changes. The death of Louis of Orleans, your new husband's father, in 1407 would become the spark that ignited open civil war. Your new family, already volatile, was thrown into mourning and danger. Charles became the new Duke of Orleans at the age of 13, and you, now 17, became the Duchess of a faction at war. But unlike your mother-in-law or other noblewomen of your time, you did not become a political operator. You did not fund armies. You did not dispatch messages to allies. She withdrew. Historians note that your health began to decline. Some say it was grief. Others believe it was a slow illness. But what is certain is that you began to fade from public life. You spent more and more time in your rooms. You rarely appeared at court. There were no children from your second marriage. And while that was not uncommon, especially given your husband's age, at the time, it also meant that you were once, again, symbolically barren. In a world where a woman's worth was tied to fertility and alliance, you were 19 when you died. Some records say it was a short illness. Others suggest it was a long decline, but no one seemed to have truly noticed the moment when the former child, Queen, slipped away. There were no grand national days of mourning, no prolonged tributes, just a quiet burial and a fading memory. Your story became footnotes, a detail in the broader wars. A girl married for peace, twice, and forgotten twice over. But what would have happened if you had lived? Would you have become a political matron like your mother? Would you have stood beside Charles as he matured into one of France's greatest poets and statesmen? Or would the weight of being passed like coin between kingdoms, between causes, have continued to wear you down until all that remained was a performance of dignity? We do not know. because the history books close too quickly on women like you, especially when they are quiet, especially when they die young. Asterisk. You were born to the House of Valois in 1389, a daughter of kings in a France shadowed by war, hunger, and the slow, unraveling madness of your father. You came into the world under banners of blue and gold, amidst brocade and incense, destined for splendor, but not freedom, because daughters of royalty were not really children. They were contracts waiting to be signed. They were gifts to be wrapped, presented, and exchanged. You didn't yet know that, but others did. From the moment you took your first breath, negotiations began. A daughter, good, useful. France needed peace with England. You were not the first attempt before you. There had been other royal brides sent to bridge the English Channel. Eleanor of Provence, Margaret of Anjou, Isabella of France. Each was meant to secure peace. Each was meant to turn bloodshed into alliance. It never worked, but still they tried. And so you were betrothed to a king 23 years your senior at age 6. You were taught to walk like a queen at age 7. You were given a crown scaled to fit your head. At age 8, you were married ceremonially, carefully, symbolically, to Richard II of England, a man approaching 40. It was not a union of pays, not yet. But it was a union of territories. Your name was stamped on treaties. Your dowry was weighed in golden cities. And then England fell apart. Richard was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. You were left in limbo, a child queen without a king, a French girl held in England like a chess piece no one wanted to move. When they finally let you go home, France was no longer the one you remembered. Your father had grown worse. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass. Sometimes he ran from his own children. Your mother, Zobo of Bavaria, had taken over as regent in all but name. She ruled as best she could in a kingdom split between factions. Orleans and Burgundy had held together, by exhausted ceremony. Your return was not a celebration. It was an afterthought. You were no longer a queen, just a young widow with no power. In no place they married you again, this time to your cousin, Charles of Orleans, a child like yourself. 11 to your 13. This time there were no elaborate coronations, no ceremonies in foreign tongues, just papers, witnesses, and a quiet hope that maybe this marriage, this alliance, would not end in blood. It didn't, but it didn't flourish either. There were no children. There was little public life. You became the Duchess of a house embroiled in France's internal civil war, caught between assassins and poets, between loyalty and chaos. And through it all, you retreated further into silence. The official chronicles don't say much about those final years. A few court payments, a handful of letters, and then your death. 19 years old. No fanfare. No royal funeral recorded in shimmering detail. You were interred in the Abbey of Saint Lamer, asterisk,